In this talk, we will look at discrepancies between database-driven NLG and pragmatically driven NLG, specifically the kinds of insights that question under discussion-based annotation and QD tree structures can give us. First, we'll look at the specifics of the type of text that we're looking at, which in our case are driving reports, and then we'll go through the annotation process, look at the kinds of QEDs that we use, and then we'll focus on three important distinctions: the distinction between focus and background, between topic and comment, and at issue and not at issue content, before we'll show some results from our corpus. We want to generate text from two sources: a database of technical vehicle specifications and QD trees of text discourse structure annotated for factual as well as evaluative assertions, and especially the evaluative part is the hard part. So in order to come up with a text plan, the typical approach is to base that on rhetorical relations. However, rhetorical relations are not constraint based, and they are more descriptive than they are really explanatory, and we're trying to have a principled approach which explains certain linguistic phenomena, such as specific types of rhetorical relations like contrast, focus structure, and to predict what sort of rhetorical relations we would need to generate. The assumption here is that QED-based approaches we think are more suitable for theory-driven text plans. And these text plans try to divide text into text spans and sentences, and we look at them as answers to implicit or explicit questions under discussion. And discourse coherence, under this QD view, is the systematic answering of discourse questions by partitioning chunks of information and sequencing them, right? So here's a simple example. We have these vehicle reports that we're trying to model and generate. Every report is about a specific vehicle, a specific car. So the overarching discourse question is this car good? And in answering that, we expect that certain properties of the vehicle, the car, will be named and evaluated. So things like the engine, the suspension, the interior design, the comfort level, the accessories, the extras, gas mileage, all these sorts of things, and obviously the evaluation of the car as a whole should be the sum of the evaluation of the parts, or the different categories that are being evaluated. So QD approach is very nice because you can sort of take this part-whole relation and map it to a QD structure where you say, well, you want to evaluate the entire car, so you break that down into different text sections. There's going to be a section about the engine. That section is going to talk about acceleration, about maximum speed, about the performance of the engine. So let's have different QUDs that ask for the acceleration, for the maximum speed, for the performance, and then as a whole answering those three sub-QUDs, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 answers QUD 1 is the engine good, and then we move on to the next section of the text. Let's say that one is about suspension, and there's going to be different technical aspects that go into a good suspension, and those questions are going to be answers to whether the suspension is good, and then all of those sections together answer the question whether the vehicle is good. So this text type of driving reports is very good for this QED-based annotation. The theoretical background that we're using here comes from various strands of information structure theory and discourse coherence. So we have Carlson and Ginsberg talking about dialogue moves. We have contextual relevance with Roberts. We have information structural concepts such as focus and background in Roberts, van Kupperveld, Stutterheim. Temporal progression in narration, sequential ordering of information in Klein and von Stutterheim, and the analysis of coherence relations and subordination, again Klein and von Stutterheim and van Kupperveld. However, despite a large theoretic interest in QEDs, to our knowledge, there's only one attempt at annotation guidelines for QEDs and a tool using QED annotation, namely by Andriester and colleagues. Even though there's this tool, no one's used it yet for NLG, so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to test predictions from these theories by building an NLG system. So it is a principled approach that uses QED annotation to test those predictions. So here's a more complicated example from our corpus, where you see in green and red what sort of the mix of types of information is. So we have in green objective facts from the database. So there's objective statements, assertions about certain technical facts that should come from the database. And then the red portions, those are the subjective, expressive, evaluative parts of the text. Right? So this one's about a motorcycle, Africa Twin, a fully equipped Africa Twin with electronic suspension, costs 18 plus €1,000, including auxiliary delivery costs and luggage system. It then joins the club of 20k touring enduros. First test rides show the matter with the chassis is complicated. And the new conventional suspension, which is fitted without exception in the basic twin and as standard in the sports adventure, does its job extremely well. Extremely well is an evaluation. What's being said about this suspension? The electronic suspension option available for the latter, €1,600 extra, is even more sensitive, but the difference will not be noticeable for everyone. We bet the top version will sell well. So there's multiple layers of evaluation here. It's even more sensitive. However, the difference won't be noticeable, right? So there's like a conclusion and then even a prediction, which again is not just a prediction, it's also an evaluation. All of our texts have this really intricate combination of factual information and highly expressive evaluations. And it's not like you have a portion that is just fact-based and a portion that is evaluative. You have this mix. So it's always mixed, sometimes in the same sentence, sometimes in the same assertions. So we used QUD-based annotation to annotate 30 German texts, these driving reports. And for our purposes, the crucial information structural distinctions that we're making in this QUD annotation is focus versus background, topic versus comment, and also at issueness, so whether content portions of an assertion are at issue for the QED or not at issue. The annotation process itself is rather complicated, obviously. You have these very complicated, pragmatically complex texts with this mix of factual and evaluative information, so the annotation process is quite challenging. First, we divide the text into sections. We identify individual assertions. Then next, we identify what portions of the assertions are at issue and which portions are not at issue. Then we divide assertions into text spans. Which of those are focus, which of them are background, which of them are topic, and which of them are comment. We formulate QEDs fitting focus, background, and topic comment analysis, which is obviously the major point here. One small bullet point, but this is actually the main portion of the work. And then again, an easier task is indexing the constituents. You'll see why we need indexing, things like split focus and split background, but also enumeration. And because this annotation process works bottom up, in comparison to the work by Riester and colleagues, we get left branching and right branching hierarchical QED structures, and we take those to be a representation of rhetorical relations as well as text sections all the way up to discourse questions. So all of the argumentative structure as well as very structural things like the text sections. And the resulting QED trees have concrete factual information which can be translated to database queries on leaf nodes, and the level of abstraction increases as you go up in the tree towards the root node, right? Because higher up in the tree you get the more evaluative, more argumentative QEDs. So the key thing for us, obviously, because we want to do NLG, the QEDs need to be formulated with database queries in mind. And there's different levels of difficulty, obviously, here, depending on the kinds of assertions and how complex those assertions are. So a very simple case is just a single fact. So that could be something about an acceleration 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in 5.7 seconds, and then we could just formulate a QED that says what's the car's acceleration. And it's very obvious that this type of QED is easily mapped to a database query looking up the acceleration value in this case. Also easy is list enumeration. So that's just a case of multiple facts. Let's say there's a list of multiple models of a car. So we could just ask what models are available, and then we translate that to a database query that looks at all of the models of the car and retrieves that list, and that's just a list of n models, right? It's fairly straightforward. What is more difficult is all of the evaluative content in the text, right? The subjective, evaluative, expressive content. One example would be something like an aesthetic question concerning the interior and the target audience, and how changes to the interior might affect the target audience. So it's a very complicated question that spawns a sub-QED structure, which probably has multiple aspects to it, like there's changes. So what was the previous target audience? Which target audience is likely to be attracted to certain kinds of interior design? What are those interior design choices aesthetically? So it's a host of sub-questions, and the point is the kinds of arguments that we find in the text, they're not just very complicated, they are very nuanced arguments with a lot of foregrounding and backgrounding of information. So in essence, all of the information presented is being presented as relevant, but it's still graded depending on how important it is or whether it is less important. So the QED structure, in essence, also needs to reflect the importance that certain bits of information as evidence in an argument. Focus and background are propositional attributes. Focus is the new information, background is the old information. Focus, the new information, is an answer to a QED, whereas the background should be part of how you formulate the QED in the first place, because it is either part of the QED, phrasing itself, or it is presupposed by the QED. And foci map to syntactic constituents, the focus domains. A single focus domain contains what is called a focus exponent, which is the most salient element of this focus domain. There are two functions of focus, namely one is to provide new information, the other one is to contrast information. The problem is that the distinction between given and new information is not always applicable. One example is what we call split focus. That's a case where you have multiple focus constituents which actually answer one and the same QED. So here's a sentence: in the practical outer skin to a 6-meter short 5-door car, the engine was hardly noticeable at first. We have this QED. What about the power unit portion with the 3.6 meters and the 5 doors intervenes in between what is the focus? Based on that QED, we also know that what we are calling focus here is the core information of this assertion. That's what the assertion is trying to say. It's trying to say that this is a small car and it's surprising that the engine is so powerful. And there's different signals. Instead of saying 3.6 meters long, it says 3.6 meters short. Little wordplay here, and also explicitly stating that it has 5 doors because small cars usually only have 3 doors, emphasizing the point that there's not much room for the engine anyway. So there's multiple layers sort of emphasizing how small the car is, and you need to decode those in order to understand the argument why this is hardly noticeable and why it being hardly noticeable is a surprising fact. The point here is, if you have this QED, what about the power unit, which the assertion is clearly trying to answer? You get the sense that there must be higher QEDs representing this argument about like why it is counterintuitive that this car has a very powerful engine given its size. So you get the sense that there must be more structure to this. Another example is coordination. The Renault Captur grows and changes its character. This is not just a coordination of two facts, right? It's a coordination that has a certain poetic effect, if you will. That needs to be reflected by a QED, so by having them both answer the same QED, we're sort of paying tribute to that. Another example is in a special type of ellipsis. In this case, we have to look, which can also mean to appear a certain way. The QED here is how have the aesthetics changed compared to the old Captur. We learned that they have changed in a way that makes the car appear sharply trained, and it also makes it appear ready to attack. And there's two versions of these verbs in German. So one version has the preposition prefixed. So you can have the aus with the sieht, aussehen. And then there's a non-prefixed version where you split them. You have the verb stem as a full verb, as the main verb, and then the preposition is actually realized syntactically as a preposition. And the crucial thing here is there's ellipsis happening, but there's also pied piping happening. Another distinction that we're making in the corpus is that between topic and comment. The topic is the discord referent of the comment, and the comment is a statement about the topic. The topic is often introduced via indefinite means and later on picked up anaphorically. Topic structures might involve contrastive topics. Topics are contained in the phrasing of QEDs, and topics map to database variables. So for the genre of driving reports, topics are vehicles and vehicle parts. And we also want to use indexing for co-reference because metonymy can pose problems and indexing can help with that. Another crucial distinction is that between at issue and not at issue. At issue content is all the information relevant in a given context. Not at issue content, however, is not irrelevant information. It's additional optional information, which is not speaking to the immediate QUD, but it nevertheless supplies useful information that is relevant in some sense. Not at issue content is a whole separate assertion of its own. That's usually how it's portrayed in the literature. It has its own QUD. This QUD is then, of course, subordinated to the QUD of the at issue content in the main assertion. This sub QUD can then have its own independent focus structure. Using QUD trees, we have these various different kinds of embedding structures. In this case, it's corresponding to degrees of at issueness. But it could also be focus structure related. It could represent rhetorical relations. It could be modeling a certain line of argument in a text, right? Because the QUD approach allows us to do all of these things and combine all of them in the same annotation, which is very useful. Examples of non-at-issue content include evaluative adverbs, what licenses the use of words like surprisingly and remarkably, and also embedding verbs, like they say that the car is overpriced, where it's quite obvious the core information is that the car is overpriced, not that someone made a statement. And specifically, licensing conditions of evaluative adverbs are of great interest to us. So here's an example. Surprisingly, the new Kawasaki consumes 4 liters less gas despite its 5% weight increase in comparison to the previous generation of this model. You need technical understanding of the connection between weight and gas consumption, which is necessary in order to decode the licensing conditions of the adverb. This sort of information cannot be queried from the database, but must be inferred from domain knowledge, and it must inform the phrasing of QEDs and QED structures, right? There must be a model in the background that says something like, if the weight increases, it's likely that the gas consumption will increase. So if you look at the database and you see that the gas consumption is actually decreased rather than increased, that's counterintuitive, and that contradiction is what licenses the use of surprisingly. Our database contains marks 1 to 6 for each evaluation criterion, and annotators need to take special care in identifying not at issue content. So here are some preliminary results from our corpus analysis concerning inter-annotator agreement on the categorization, concerning the at issue, not at issue distinction, the distinction focus background, and another category which we're just calling miscellaneous or auxiliary. We're using the gamma coefficient by method rather than Krippendorff's alpha because alpha is sensitive to length of text segments while gamma is not. A gamma of 1 means annotators are in perfect agreement about the structures. Gamma below 0 means the annotator agreement is worse than if labels were just assigned randomly. And what we see is annotators disagree on information structural labels. We think this low agreement comes from differences in tree structure rather than disagreement about which facts are relevant. So annotators agree what is in focus and what is not, what is background, what is not, and what is at issue. But since the phrasing of QEDs heavily influences tree structure, structural differences do not necessarily mean annotators differ in their text interpretation. So the challenge is not to decide which facts should be realized, it's actually to determine how to realize them so that they support a specific argument. Not all QEDs are fact-oriented, but they can also be evaluative, subjective, and expressive, as we saw. QED structure are not simply derivable from focus structures. Depending on whether they are positive or negative in the specific case of a specific vehicle, they will take on different roles in the argument, and that obviously completely changes the argumentative structure, meaning the QED trees look radically different. Argumentation often anticipates counterfactual information, implicit assumptions, causal logic, which must be spelled out in QEDs. So an analysis of these pragmatically rich texts is not reducible to QEDs translating to database queries. Conclusions for NLG or linguistic analysis is relevant and important for NLG. Without good annotation, you get poor results from machine learning of discourse structures. Linguistic annotation is non-trivial, to say the least. In order to be able to do machine learning on this data, we want to extend the small corpus with additional data from the German Motoring Association, the ADAC, so we can do unsupervised learning.